Welcome back to Real Food Mental Health with Cody Cox. Today we have an inspiring guest, Patrick Eilers. He is a licensed professional counselor based in Michigan, but he's recently transitioned into coaching. In 2023, he became a certified professional life coach and is set to launch his own practice, Bloomworks Concepts and Coaching. With experience in therapy for anxiety, depression, addiction, particularly sexual addiction, Patrick has also taught at Concordia University, Ann Arbor, and Jackson College. He's passionate about empowering individuals to navigate life's challenges and achieve their goals. A guest recently told me that something like 95% of podcasts fail within the first few episodes, and I can see why, because there is so much time and energy that goes into the production of a show like this one. If you would like to support me in the production of this podcast, go to ko-fi.com/Cody Cox. That's ko-fi.com/Cody Cox. You can pay a couple dollars or you can pay more if that's something you can afford. But either way, I'm going to continue to produce free content for as long as I possibly can because this information is so important and I want everybody to be able to access it. Thanks so much for listening today. Welcome to the Real Food Mental Health Podcast, where we explore the powerful connection between mental and physical health. My name is Cody Cox, a holistic nutritional psychotherapist, and I'm here to guide you on a journey to true wellness, mind, body, and spirit. If you're tired of quick fixes and want real solutions that address the root cause, you're in the right place. Let's get started on your path to lasting wellness. Welcome back to Real Food Mental Health with Cody Cox. Today's guest is Patrick Eilers. Welcome, Patrick.
Thanks, Cody. Appreciate it. Looking forward to being here.
So, Patrick, you are a licensed professional counselor in Michigan, but you've also gone to life coaching. Tell us a little bit about why you've transitioned a little bit more to the coaching side of things.
Yeah, so I'm been a counselor for about 9 years now, and so I've been in the professional space, for almost a decade now, kind of working to some degree, whether it be individual counseling, couples counseling. I was an adjunct professor for a little while, teaching intro to psychology at one of the couple of universities here locally in Michigan. So I've done some different things in the field, but I really, the last 4 years or so, I've been working specifically in the realm of sex addiction. So that's been kind of a specific niche for me, relatively new. And I learned, if anyone's familiar with Dr. Patrick Eilers, he's kind of the founder of that particular program that we learned, and we kind of learned everything, basically from how to help people, at the beginning of their recovery process all the way to the end, and that includes going through disclosure with their partner and those kind of things. And one of the things I noticed about it just right off the bat, or at least a couple of years into it, was that, there were a lot of people who were going through this, it's a 3 to 5 year program. It's a pretty intense amount of therapy that you have to do. I could think about it like that old show, This Old House with Bob Vila, kind of like you had to deconstruct the whole entire home in order to kind of get to a foundation and kind of rebuild the house. And so one of the things I noticed is that some people were not in a position that they needed that type of intensity. There was certainly an element of people getting burned out, a year or two into the program, and they're, at the point where they're kind of like, hey, this is just, I want to continue to go forward because this is what my partner wants me to do, and this is what all the experts are saying to a degree. But for me, I'm really struggling. But at the same time, I'm maintaining my sobriety. I'm not acting out anymore. I'm not having a healthy relationship sexually. I'm not watching porn, etc. So one of the things I started looking at was just the idea of like how can we start to change some of these things in the field from a perspective of just being able to be more impactful, more inspirational, really helping people who are kind of in that in-between space, the people who maybe don't need to take their whole house apart, but maybe those people who need kind of a initial space, 6 months or so, 6 months to a year kind of service to kind of move them in a direction. And life coaching really offers that. I think about, kind of going the show idea, like the life coaching is more like bar rescue or like Gordon Ramsay, right? It's kind of the short term kind of kick in the pants, give you some really good tools, kind of redo some of those spaces you're in and gives you kind of a jumping point. And then down the road, if that's something that isn't maintaining, then that's where you might have more of the conversation looking at something like a recovery program or deeper level of therapy. But I think there's a lot of people in that space between those two things. And so that's really kind of what motivated me to want to move into the life coaching space. I'm calling it mental wellness coach, but same kind of idea.
Yeah.
being in that sort of space of just helping people in the short term rather or the shorter term rather than necessarily the long term.
Yeah, and I mean, coaching definitely reaches a broader audience, and so good for you for recognizing that need. I definitely think there's a need for professionals who can help people through sex addiction. But in your opinion, I know you have years of experience in this. What would you say is the number one cause of a sex addiction? Because that one seems to be
Yeah.
pretty controversial. Like some people would even say it's not even a problem to have a sex
Hmm.
addiction, but what's the cause of it?
Yeah, there's it, and as I'm stumbling here, the easiest answer probably is just to say that it's a case by case scenario. I mean, that's probably the most honest answer I can give you as far as everybody kind of has their own story. I really think it depends on some age groups and it depends on kind of where people's experiences have been as they've grown up. So you look at people who are prior to the internet. So I'm talking, people who've been, 18 and up before 1995. Let's just say that as their year. Most of those folks usually have had some type of experience with print pornography or a sexual abuse scenario or an early sexual experience with a partner, whatever that is. I mean, not that the people that post that haven't either, but certainly those folks usually have a more of a foundation in those kind of what I would call traditional type of addiction spaces. So when you're looking at sex addiction, there's about 10 different criteria we'd look for, and they would meet, not that the people post 95 wouldn't, but certainly those people would probably fit much more the traditional type of, basis for where that would start. So some of those type of things I just gave examples of. Post 95 ish or post internet. So like I was born in 1989, so I kind of was born in kind of a little bit of both eras. But certainly when you're older, when you're sixth, seventh, eighth grade, the internet was kind of at a position where there was still a lot of it was, and it still is. There's still a lot of it that we're learning about how it affects human beings. But certainly at that point in life, getting kind of caught up in the pornography space was pretty easy and still is. And it's one of the big reasons why people are struggling with it as young as 7, 6 years old. I mean, there's
Oh
kids
yeah.
that are real young that are getting hooked, and they're getting hooked because they have access to it, and because there's a curiosity factor, and because there's a getting away with it factor. There's a lot of different things at play. And when those things start to elevate, then what ends up happening is again, it becomes an obsession. So when that becomes an obsession, that's where the sort of addiction piece, I think, mentally comes into play. Then your body likes to do the same thing over and over again. You kind of pair those two together. You start to have a consistent pattern over and over again of how I cope with my stress, right? My stress is coped through pornography or some type of sexual behavior as reduction of stress and those kind of things. Typically it's pornography. Sometimes it can be pornography assisted masturbation. Sometimes it's masturbation alone. Those all kind of fall in that same kind of space. So the reason I kind of identify those two differences is because I think people who are older, their story is going to look a little different. They're going to have some type of physical encounter before they have pornography become later, usually a later concern. Sometimes, not all the time, but the
Right.
younger folks definitely have more of a. This has been built into their life. This is how they learn how to cope with it when they were 5, 6, 7 years old. So you see a completely different type of attitude toward it. I think from the perspective of this is just what's worked for me. I may not like it, but this is the only thing I found that helps me. So it's a different type of, I think, approach to it than somebody who maybe had print pornography and then they kind of got away from it and they got married and they had unhealthy relationships and then later on circled back to porn. It's just a different kind of journey. So I do think that certainly people who are younger have a different type of challenge with it. And again, you can't escape a lot of stuff with the internet. You can't avoid everything on the internet. You can't avoid, I mean, you can do what you can do, but I mean, what I look at it is either you're going to be able to put boundaries in place that are going to keep you from having less opportunity, or you're going to have opportunity. And opportunity will present itself no matter what, even on things that are not supposed to be sexual. I've talked about a lot of other podcasts about the idea that, there's a lot of hypersexuality in things that aren't meant to be sexual. So you see it in Instagram all the time. There's the girl hiking in the mountains, and there's a really awesome view of this great mountain, but then there's also a girl here in the corner wearing yoga pants. Now, inherently, she's not trying to sexualize that particular um, picture, and I'm not saying that that was an intentional thing, but it's become something that can become very sexualized for people who view that. And even if it's not something that's explicit sexual material, so you keep adding in some of that stuff, you keep adding in the people have this access to it all the time, coupled with opportunity, which usually comes in the form of the phone going in the bedroom or the bathroom because we have a very intimate relationship with our devices.
Hmm.
opportunity continues to present itself, it becomes a cycle, and you see it kind of over and over again. So, like I said, sort of different ages sort of play it differently, but that seems to be one of the things that does have a pretty big impact on folks and their kind of the continual behavior.
There are certainly generational nuances to this, and in my professional experience, I used to work with a lot with pornography, still kind of do sometimes, but it seems like a lot of it comes from a lack of like a sense of connection
Mm-hmm.
with other people. So it might be relationship based, but then, like you said, some people are coming from a physical experience first, and that makes me wonder about sexual abuse,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
which I guess you could also tie into relationships in some way, but what have you seen with that?
Yeah, sexual abuse could be definitely be something that people have experienced in that. I wouldn't say the way I look at it is I wouldn't say it's common, but I wouldn't say it's uncommon. And again, it depends really on sort of the person's age range and experiences and et cetera. So it would be one of those 10 criteria that you would look for. Again, compulsive behavior, that would be in one of those. It would be in that criteria. But again, not everybody has all 10 of those criteria. Sometimes they have 9 of the 10 or 8 of the 10 or whatever. But it's rare for somebody to have. Well, it's mostly rare for somebody to have all 10 of those things be part of their life, and it can be a variety. It could be depression, could be a struggle with like you said, relationships is a big part of that. Other type of psychological or physiological issues in the family certainly is a big part of it, that generational gap that you talked about. So there's some things in that would be in those criteria that we would look for if you're talking about diagnosing sex addiction. There's a lot of those things again with diagnosis. There's kind of that space where in order to be diagnosed, it has to meet X amount of criteria, but you have a lot of the other symptoms that are sort of surrounding it. So most likely, it probably lends to that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you were diagnosable. I think with the sex addiction, if I remember right, it's you have to have at least 3 of the 10. So it doesn't there's not a huge space there between before that becomes diagnosable in that sense.
Hmm. I wasn't aware that there was an official diagnosis for sex addiction.
Well, so no, so you're right. So there, I guess let me rephrase that. So when we use when you're a CSAT, so certified sex addiction therapist, we have an assessment that we use called an SDI, sexual dependency inventory, and that inventory will give you criteria that looks for those 10 particular things in order to sort of be leaning toward that idea that you're probably diagnosable as sexually compulsive, or in that sense that would be the kind of the official term. You have to meet that criteria. Otherwise, if you meet 1 of the 10, you wouldn't be, you're not qualified to be in that space. Because there's not an official diagnosis, a lot of times people get, sort of secondary diagnosis. I think it's unhealthy compulsive behavior or unhealthy sexual behavior. I can't remember, something like that.
So I'll typically diagnose people with unspecified impulse disorder.
Something like that, or like
Yeah,
a generalized anxiety. It's a pretty common one. So
yeah.
sometimes I put if people have more depression symptoms, it would be an unspecified depressive disorder with a
Mhm.
secondary of yep, of something with unhealthy sexual behavior.
So kind of jumping back to the origin of sex addiction, I have noticed, um, well, I tend to analyze the social influences of these things, and so I have noticed that younger generations are definitely in a harder spot when it comes to these things. You were mentioning how it's very normal to take your cell phone into the bathroom because that's an intimate thing. We have this relationship with our
Yep.
smartphone. But the problem with that is we have easier access to this pornography. And it's not even just plain pornography. It's the soft porn that you were describing earlier too,
Mm,
where it might be Instagram, it might be Facebook, and I'm hearing a lot of my clients say, "Yeah, I was doing fine until I saw this Instagram post."
yep.
Where it's like it's a girl in a bikini or even just yoga pants or something that most people would think is pretty innocent. It can trigger this cascade of obsessive thoughts, which then leads to relapse.
Yep. Very common for that to
So,
happen.
if you were to treat somebody with sex addiction, what are some of the more common methods that you use that seem to help most people?
Well, the program that we were in kind of approached it from three different perspectives. So there was the individual therapy that you did with someone like me. There was the component of working in a group with another group of guys who were struggling with some of the same kind of thing, and then there was a what they call a sponsor, so similar to like an AA type of thing, having somebody who's like a one-on-one relationship. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head earlier when you said it's a lot about relationship. The two of the biggest areas I've seen that people respond to a lot that they talk about are shame, which is a big reason why people don't get any help. They stay isolated. The more isolated you are, the more likely you're going to probably continue those behaviors. The secondary part to that is that when you're isolated, again, just like I said, opportunity is there. So when people don't get involved with, and there's lots of groups out there beyond just ours. So the program we were part of is, that's Dr. Karn's material, but something like SA, so Sexaholics Anonymous, SAA, and SLAA. Those are kind of three of them, and they're very similar to like an AA program or 12-step. And really, the idea there is to try to get again more people together that are struggling with something similar, to build those relationships, to build that community, and then being able to move forward. Now, the one difference about Dr. Karn's program is that there's a therapist that's facilitating those groups. So it's not the same
Mhm.
kind of thing as it would be like an AA group where you're coming together and everyone's kind of sharing their experience. And that's kind of the typical model that moves forward. It's self-directed. Whereas in the Dr. Karn's group, you're the one as the therapist, you're facilitating that direction. So it's kind of like a half and half
So
between like a
it's actually group therapy rather than a support group.
closer to it. Yeah, it's a little
Yeah.
more. So they call it process groups. So it's similar to, it's kind of like a half and half between like an educational piece where you have material you're following, and then also having an opportunity for people to share and what their reflections are and feedback and stuff like that. So it's kind of a mix, and people seem to respond to that pretty well. In my experience with the groups can get very tight knit. They really build a lot of camaraderie there. They like to hear each other's stories. It takes a little while to kind of build that up as you kind of go forward. But once everyone usually shares their first step or their kind of their story, people are a little more open to kind of talking more openly about things. And so the group work was always pretty successful. I felt like as far as their improvement in relationships. The one-on-one relationship is important because they're building that sort of space where they can continue to be more transparent. Again, that's something they're practicing with their partner too. But certainly, when you're in this relationship with a sponsor, you kind of learn that they're a safe place as well as the therapist. So that model seems to work pretty good for how to sort of attack it. I guess if you weren't going to be in a program, I would say getting involved with some type of group or something like that where people are struggling with some of the same things, and whether it be 12-step or a faith-based one would be CR, Celebrate Recovery, and just being able to share your story, I think, is a pretty big piece, making those connections. And then as you continue to move forward there with that, having some type of either a life coach or a therapist or somebody that knows more about sex addiction than just the average therapist. Not that average therapists don't know a lot about it because they work with it a lot too, but CSAT specifically are usually trained in kind of helping a person go through a program like that. Like, there's a book material they can help them out with. There's, certain reflections they can help them out with, certain things you'd look at maybe a little differently than a regular therapist might. So there's different ways you can do that. But those are some things you can consider when you're looking at treatment.
Hmm. Yeah, there are a lot of support groups out there, and
Mm-hmm.
I was going to mention my church does an addiction recovery program, and it follows the same 12 steps as
Yep.
AA,
Yep.
but it's altered. So we've got a pornography addiction group and a general addiction group, and so theoretically you could go to this with any sort of addiction. But you mentioned the value in having peers. So just working through this as a group and knowing that there are people in your group who are dealing with the same thing or a similar thing, that can be powerfully motivating,
Absolutely.
which can then be more likely to guarantee your success in overcoming it, or at least finding improvement, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, like you said, there's also value in having a therapist one-on-one or a coach one-on-one, because as you build that rapport, that personal or professional relationship with this person, then you can go even farther and more deeply into your personal problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a lot of times, especially with the sex addiction piece, is that, it tends to be that it does encompass a lot of people's lives. I always, my analogy I use when we talk about kind of what does that look like in your life is, it's a fish tank. Your fish tank is full of all kinds of things in your life that are alive. And if you drop a couple drops of red food coloring in the water's going to turn red. You're going to have to learn how to navigate your life with this red water. You can't take the water, everything else dies. So it does touch all parts of your life if the secret is broken, so to speak, or comes out. Certainly can affect not only your personal relationship with your partner, can create a lot of what they call partner betrayal trauma for a partner. They become hyper vigilant and kind of what's knowing, there's a loss of trust, those kind of things there. And then beyond that, the effect of, could be affecting your job, could affect your other parts of your personal life. I know I've had people where, they're acting out in the bathroom. They're going to work, they're taking the phone in the bathroom and masturbating in the bathroom, those kind of things. And that's not uncommon for that to happen. But that's again part of that intimate relationship with the device, and so part of those opportunities are breaking that relationship you have with that device. And so a lot of that is trying to remove the device from intimate spaces, which again include the bathroom and the bedroom particularly.
And that can be so hard. It kind of depends on your lifestyle, really. If you're a
Mm-hmm.
student, if you're a professional, sometimes you really need to have your phone with you.
Yep.
But a strategy that I like to use is I'll have people change their phone to grayscale,
Okay. Yep.
where
Keep
they
the
can
color
still
the.
essentially do most things on their phone. It doesn't lock them out of anything, but grayscale really reduces that dopamine spike that they're getting when they see the bright colors on the screen. And
Yep.
so it's way more boring to the brain, but it tends to work as people keep it on grayscale. And yeah, I do have people come back and they're like, well, it was annoying, so I changed it back to color. But
Right.
the people
Yeah.
who keep it on grayscale
Mm.
significantly reduce their screen time.
Yep. That's a great idea. I know there is an app out there that does the same kind of thing. It minimizes a lot of the or changes a lot of the way things look, so it's much more minimized. It's either black and white or grayscale, like you said. So there are some really good tools out there with those kind of things, and I'd recommend the same kind of thing. Yeah, if you can get a way to make it be something that's not so giving you kind of the constant feedback, you'll have more success. I think breaking it.
And are there any specific apps that you would recommend? I know of Fortify, which is specifically like a kind of like a social media app,
Mm-hmm.
particularly for pornography addiction. But would you recommend any specific apps?
Yeah, there's about three that we would typically use. The big one that a lot of people know about is Covenant Eyes. And Covenant Eyes, there's pros and cons to it. The pro is that it's pretty good on catching a lot of stuff. It basically has a report I think it's every day. It prints out a report and sends it to an accountability partner. Now I recommend not the accountability partner being your partner. It needs to go to somebody who's exterior to the relationship because because a lot of times it triggers a lot of partners in that way. But some partners
Hmm.
insist on it. Just that's a whole different conversation. But um, yeah, so Covenant Eyes is a good one. There's another one called uh, I can't think of the name of it now. Uh, it's kind of like a hybrid of the same thing. Like there's a little bit of a component of accountability, but it's not as much. Doesn't give you reports all the time. Basically, just whatever pops up that's a concern, it will send an alert. And then there's ones that there's some more like the kids kind of apps where they have like Gab phones. I know it's a pretty big one as well. To just basically eliminate the ability to be online. So there are some things like that can be really that can help a lot, just as far as being able. And like I said, I can't think of any specific names, so I apologize. But um, there are some of those kind of things out there like that can be just again, it's kind of a total lockout. But if you may need that if that's where it comes to. I mean, again, depends on kind of where you're at personally, but those things can really make a big difference.
And I think the lockouts have to be self-imposed for most
Mhm.
people because if it's a child and they feel like their parent is just restricting them, they're going to find some way around it. When it's self-imposed, you kind of remember in the back of your mind what your why is. Like, why am I doing this? Why does this matter? Which makes you more likely to respect those self-restrictions.
It can be, what I've discovered is that sometimes the excitement is to try to find a way around the thing. So that's another part of it is that, and even if it's self imposed, I've had people where they just that's what they find it to be entertaining is try to find a way to get around it. But like you said, if it's self imposed, sometimes they already know how to do that, so that does take some of the excitement away of it. Sometimes a partner will be the one that will put the restriction in, so they have the access to it, and that kind of feels more like you said, same kind of thing. Like mom and dad are kind of taking something away from me, and then I think the curiosity goes up. So it depends on the person. I think there has to be a little bit of that balance to that for sure.
Yeah. And I found particularly with like a screen addiction, for instance, when people put on the screen time settings on their iPhone and it tells them you've reached your screen limit for today, what do? They just manually override it and they
Right.
keep doing what they were doing. But I always tell people at least it's making you think twice about it.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's giving you an option.
So it might be better to turn it on anyway, even if you know that you're going to override it, because it makes you start being aware of what you're doing,
Yep,
where you might not otherwise be aware.
absolutely. Awareness is huge. I mean, I think at any kind of time you're working on yourself, it all starts with it being aware. It all starts with understanding kind of what you're doing, and I find a lot of people have good awareness. It's the awareness and then the continued expect sort of acceptance of that awareness. I think is a big challenge sometimes.
Yeah, acceptance is a huge challenge. I do a lot of mindfulness work, and
Mm.
acceptance, I've come up with three main parts of mindfulness that I teach everyone, and that's awareness of the present moment, acceptance for the things that we can't change, acting on purpose for the things that we can change. Now, with that wording, you might notice that it has some similarities with the Serenity Prayer, and
Yeah.
I actually did lead Alcoholics Anonymous groups years ago, not realizing that what I was teaching was part of the Serenity Prayer.
Hmm.
So it's coming from these 12-step groups. But I kind of wanted to segue into more of the Alcoholics Anonymous, the spiritual focus of the 12-step groups a little bit more. How do you typically address, from a spiritual standpoint, something like a sex addiction?
Yeah, the big thing I think, from a and again, this is some sort of also what Dr. Carnes would teach in their program. And again, I think AA and SA and a lot of the 12-step groups would also agree. And a lot of the work he did was kind of based on their experience of AA and 12-step and the success they had. Is really the idea that it comes back to we talked earlier about relationships, and that's part of it. But I think the other big part of it that people are missing is their purpose. What is their purpose? I really like. I don't know if you've ever heard of Simon Sinek, but he's got some really good material out there for businesses. But one of his things is the golden circle, and his three are the what's your earlier you said what's your why, how are you going to execute that, and then kind of basically what's the third one I think is your what is your what's your what are you going to do in order to execute your how and your why, so to speak. So basically, like,
Mhm.
so there's a purpose there is essentially what I'm trying to say, is that there's a basically it brings you a vision for where you're going. And one of the things I used to tell the guys when I worked with them in the program is that like your vision is your down the road space. Like if you're in a mountain range, the first mountain you're going to climb may not be the highest mountain, but that's the first place you're going to start. When you get to the top of that mountain, it's going to give you the vision for them to keep going. So what does it look like in 5 years? What does it look like in 10 years? What's your vision down the road? What's your mountaintop moment that you're going to get to, that you're going to be able to see? Now, it doesn't mean it's going to look the same when you get up there, because you can imagine what it might look like when you're down at the bottom. When you got to climb up to the top of the mountain, it will look different, but it still will
Mhm.
be fulfilling of what that vision is. You need that sort of guidance in that way. And so spiritually, I think you got to have a purpose. If you don't have a purpose to what you're doing, it's all just sort of kind of, there's really no where you're going. You have no direction and up, down, backwards, forwards. And it keeps people sort of stuck in that space of just continually doing what feels good versus what maybe feels what's healthy. And I would say,
Mhm.
or say, again, especially with like masturbation, those kind of things, right? Those can give us temporary relief, but they don't necessarily cure the internal distress, which really is the lack of purpose or the lack of relationships or whatever it might be. So I think spirituality plays a big part because it gives you, for a lot of people, it gives them the anchor, gives them that space of like the base of where they're going up to the top of the mountain. Another analogy you can think about is like a cable car. If you're at the bottom, if your rock bottom is the bottom of that valley, and the top of the cable car is the division that you're going to get to, and that car's got to go all the way up that side of the mountain to get to the top. So you got to have that purpose, because that's what's going to ground you to the top of that mountain. So I think spirituality plays a huge role in that. And again, for a lot of people that I'm coming from a Christian background, so it's going to be mostly relating to a Christian perspective of, God's got a purpose for your life. God's got a purpose for where you're going. There's a reason why you're here. There's a reason why your life's been the story that it's been. And if you hold to that and understand that there's more going forward than just where you're at right here in the moment, that you'll have that direction to move forward. And now I'm kind of simplifying it, but that's sort of essentially the idea, is that you got to have someplace you're going to see yourself going to. It can't just be better than what it is. And that's a lot of times that's the first thing people will write. I'll say like, what's your vision? And they'll say, well, I want to be a better husband, or I want to work out more, or I want to eat less food that's junk food, or I want to not watch porn, or whatever it might be. And those are all great goals, but they're super vague. Like they're just kind of
Mhm.
sort of broad. you got to narrow those down into being very specific. What does it mean to be a better husband? What does it mean to be a better partner? What does it mean for you to eat better? Is that 3 meals? Is that all meals? Is that 2 meals? The more specific you are, the more that vision becomes clear.
I fear that things are getting worse in terms of, you mentioned sense of purpose, and earlier I mentioned a sense of connection. We're becoming a lot more isolated.
Mm-hmm.
And in our culture, I don't know if it's just America or if it's a kind of a worldwide thing, but in our culture, we tend to celebrate independence, individualism, but essentially we are taught to be self-sufficient and to not need other people. And the internet has exacerbated that. But what has that done to our mental health? I think not very good things. I think it's good to serve other people, serve your spouse, serve your children, serve your siblings or whoever it is that you're living with, and the people that you see outside of the home. It's good to learn how to serve better. But many of us are just sitting at home, we're staring at Instagram during our downtime. We are losing that sense of purpose, we are losing that sense of connection. And these are very, very important things that a lot of people are losing. And I would say most of it has to do with the internet.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so if we can get up and start moving physically, we're going to feel better. If we can start interacting socially, we're going to feel better. There are so many ways to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, too, a sense of purpose, that's a hard one to attain because a lot of us feel kind of caught up in a trap of having to choose a career. And once we get in the career, we feel stuck forever because we have a mortgage to pay or rent to pay, groceries to buy, things like that.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it might be you're keeping that career that you hate, but you're adding some hobbies that you love on the
Mm-hmm.
side. Finding something that makes you excited about life. I am giving away a free metabolic health bundle. This includes a Garmin fitness tracker. Garmin is a leading brand in fitness trackers. This particular model that I'm giving away does track your heart rate, your sleep, your steps, and a bunch of other things. But then, in addition to the fitness tracker, the winner will get a choice between either 2 individualized nutrition sessions with me or free entry into the Restart program, which I've mentioned on previous episodes. If you would like to enter this giveaway, go to beavercreekwellness.com/giveaway.
Yeah, I've talked a lot about in other podcasts I've done. One of the things that I feel like we haven't really answered, and we really won't be able to answer for probably another 50 years, but is that we haven't really seen the lifespan of a human being from birth till death with the internet. And what does that mean for us if we ever saw that? What does that look like for us versus people who never we have people who've been born with nothing but the internet, but we haven't had people live the entire life cycle through it. And I think what you
Mm-hmm.
said was spot on. I mean, there's a lot of disconnect, and so there are some ways that it has brought us together. I mean, obviously, it brought us together for this conversation, but in other times, there's ways it just disconnects us. And so I think that because of that, the screen has become a barrier for people to be vulnerable, and that's kind of what you're just speaking to is the ability to go out and be physically active, to be socially active, to be interactive, whatever that looks like. Those all take some level of vulnerability, maybe not a ton of vulnerability, but a little bit at a time. I think the less vulnerable we are, the more likely we're probably going to just stay cocooned and isolated from because we don't want to step out into that. One
Mm-hmm.
of the things I saw a lot, and I've seen pretty much through most of my time working with other folks, has been that vulnerability is such a huge piece of why they aren't able to move forward because they feel like who really cares about me, who's really close to me, can I trust other people? I mean, those are some of the bigger questions that they ask. They may not be verbalizing it like that, but that's what it seems like it comes back to. So what are we as human beings? How are we able to step into those spaces that are incredibly difficult? And I'll be the first one to say, man, I think as therapists, that's a hard place to be too, because we get the opportunity to walk alongside people, but we don't get an opportunity all the time to share who we really are with those people.
Right.
And so that relationship that's with other people, I mean, I value those relationships I have with my clients, and I'll always have, but I also recognize at the same time, ends up getting into this venture of being a business owner and kind of doing it for myself, that there's also spaces where those relationships are always going to have some level of distance because that's the professional space that I need to be in, and so because that's what's going to help them. So it's hard. It's a hard practice to want to and b also then execute that same idea. We can't live on intentions, and I know that's something I'm really not very good at. I want to live my life on intentions, not live my life on execution. And
Hmm.
that's something that I think is a big part of just being human. We have to be able to step in that space, and that's not easy to do, and across the board.
Yeah. Thankfully, intentions are a good starting point. It gets your mind heading in the right direction, but then you're right, you actually do have to take action
Yep.
for anything to happen. As far as I want to shift back to relationships a little bit more because that's another really common issue these days. So we kind of talked a little bit about how that ties into sex addiction. But then also, what would you say to the couple who maybe there's no sex addiction there, but there's a whole lot of conflict, isolation, lack of purpose, lack of connection?
Well, I do think there has some ties to sex addiction. Maybe not in that behavior, or maybe that's not part of what either of them are doing. But I love there's a John Gottman quote for those who guys who know John Gottman. He talks about this idea that disillusionment leads very predictably to um, or loneliness brings a direct correlation to disillusionment. And when we're disillusioned, it's very easy for us to look for exact quote is real or alternate possibilities. And I think that when there's a lot of conflict in a relationship, that elevates. We start having the wandering eye. The wandering eye gets stronger when we're disillusioned in the relationship that we're in. You see this in dating, you see this in marriage, you see this in friendships. I mean, I think less with friendship, but certainly within dating and marriage for sure. That disillusionment can really lead to a lot, like we talked about, right? Instagram becomes, you might not be looking at porn, but you're looking at the girl that you wish, or that person that you wish you were with because they have such a great looking life. There's this person over here, but they're able to do things that's a real person, a real man, real woman does those things. When you start comparing your partner, when you start stepping into that space, that's a slippery slope because if you're not bringing yourself back to some level of reality, that fantasy just grows. And I think that's a fantasy that gets fed. Before in the past, it may have only gotten fed, hey, once a week or maybe once a month or something like that. Maybe there was a coworker you saw every once in a while that you had a comparison with. But now with the internet, there's more than thousands and thousands and thousands of possibilities on top of that being every day. I mean, disillusionment just that just comes in like a wrecking ball. I mean, you're all you're going to do is compare your partner with everybody else, and then I think that also spills into yourself. How do you also compare with other people and your relationships with yourself, and how does that look like for you? So I think a lot of conflict comes from a place of, yes, it's not being able to necessarily work through and hear each other as a couple, but it also is about what you're doing on the outside of the relationship. It seems like the relationships that turn back into themselves are the ones that allow for those spaces of continued learning. And one of the things I used to talk to couples when I worked with couples was that, like, sometimes this isn't about always necessarily coming to an exact resolution to whatever this issue is. It's being able to know that you have somebody who can hear you and somebody who can understand and somebody who can relate and somebody who can verbalize that in return to you. Now, there's some issues absolutely you have to come to some conclusions with, but there's some issues that are also just that's the person who they are and they're different than the person. So that you see this a lot when people grow together, right? One person grows one way and another person grows another way. If you've committed to being with that person, then you have to adapt to that. Not easy, not fun, not something you want to do, but it's something that is part of that commitment. Is like learning how to grow with that person and loving them for where they're at now versus where they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, however long you've been together. And so I think one of the things that happens with dating in this part of the society now is that dating has become very much about instant gratification. I imagine this person should be this way, so they look this way, they act this way, they etc. I find this close the person I could to that. When that doesn't meet the specs of what I want, then I just move on to the next one. And going kind of back to the sex addiction piece is that you see people have a lot of compulsive relationships in some cases, So there does seem to be something about this idea that I'm unsatisfied or I'm not satisfied with this person. I keep trying to find what they kind of call the cosmic lover, this sort of perfect person that's out there. And social media just amplifies that idea 100 times over every single day. Um, and so I think there's a big piece of that that's also a play right now too. If people talk about wanting a relationship that their grandparents or their parents had, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, that era. Well, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have as much comparison, and once they kind of found somebody, they stayed committed to that person, no matter what happened. And so that's it's not impossible to do that, but I do think it's a different kind of challenge now than it was then because you didn't have the same level of bombardment of options because disillusionment comes pretty quickly. Kind of back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier.
Yeah, so I've been telling people for years about what I call compare and despair. I've actually seen that term in the research because when I was in graduate school, a major focus of the research that I did was on social media's effects on mental health. And they used the term compare and despair in regards to possible causes for depression and anxiety. And I
Yep.
can definitely see that, but I never thought of compare and despair and how it relates to relationships. That makes a whole lot of sense. You go on social media, even if you're not on social media, you watch YouTube, you see things
Mhm.
online. It's hard not to compare, right? And then that makes you that essentially that develops what you call that disillusionment and makes you dissatisfied with your current relationship. And you're totally right in that I often think about my grandparents who grew up in small farming towns. When they were dating, life was a lot simpler.
Mhm.
I mean, they had landline telephones, and that's it. It was expensive to make long distance phone calls.
Yep.
And so when they were dating, there wasn't a whole lot of compare and despair. I mean, yeah, there's always that high school drama, and I think it was a thing back then too.
Sure. Yeah.
But once they started dating, they were pretty well committed to each other and they didn't have that perfection mentality that you were describing. And I even experienced this when I was single. You and I are kind of at the older end of the millennials, and we have seen that where
Mhm.
when people are dating, they're looking with kind of a shopper's mentality.
Yep. It's consumeristic dating. That's what it is.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know if you have experience using like an app like Tinder. I
Yep.
used to use it, but um, I I noticed that even back then when I was single
Mhm.
and I was using these dating apps, I was like, people are being so superficial. They're looking for this perfect partner and they're not finding it. No matter what, they're always going to be disappointed because of the perfection that they're looking for.
Yep. And I think this is really where, and I probably lean to this being more of with men than women, but I think it could go both ways. This is right. This is where pornography, I think, really kind of takes a jump for people who are younger because, like you just said, so you go into a consumeristic type dating approach, right? With apps. I never used Tinder, but I've used Bumble and Hinge. Actually, met my wife on Hinge, but the reality of it is that like it's a consumeristic approach. So like if you don't feel like you're going to be at the top of that sort of food chain, so to speak, right, you're always going to sort of have those rejections or ghostings or whatever else you want to call that, sort of in that space. And how does that create a belief system around what you experience with when you see this fake experience on through pornography? So I think about like point of view videos, right? The point of view video is really about me having this sort of pseudo intimacy with this person who is a beautiful person who is going to tell me what they want to do to me. Okay, so I get to get an immediate hit from that I can experience much quicker in a way that takes literally sometimes I can take 15 seconds to find what I'm looking for. And again, it depends on where people are at in their experience because sometimes it's about seeking that particular thing out or whatever. But let's say you get to that point, and now you're bringing the disillusionment in because now you're seeking that's your standard for perfection. Your standard for perfection person, or in this case, cosmic lover, is somebody that's a porn star. Now you're not gonna have any relationship with this. They're never gonna meet this person, but your sort of mind talks you into that's what you're looking for. So now you
Yep.
bring that into consumerism dating. Now again, you could look at that from the church or from not church. The way I think about it, and this might be offensive to people, but just to a degree in the church realm, it's the person looking for the porn star who goes to church. That's what you're looking for now because you've made that standard. And so if you're outside the church, it could be the porn star, fill in the blank, wherever that is. And so you're suddenly now have this bar that's unrealistic, not real, it's fantasy based. And so now you bring that into where our world that's already swirling with fantasy anyway. That's non-sexual fantasy, but still fantasy nevertheless. It just, you get, I just, my imaginary mind, my mind goes to the fact that it's like being in a washing machine of fantasy. You're just never going to be, unless you purposely try to pull yourself out of it, you're going to be in, you got to be back into reality somehow. And that's where it
Hmm.
gets hard, I think, because our brain likes the idea of having those standards, because it's just, that's what's, enjoyable. It's enjoyable to think about being with person X or whatever the case is when you're single. So that's where I think the disillusionment comes, a lot of that disillusionment comes from.
Yes, yes, we developed this fantasy standard. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I was thinking too that we have a lot of apps, these photo editing apps, the
Yep.
filters
AI.
on our cameras, AI, all these things, even if it's a picture of a real person,
Mm-hmm.
it may have been tampered with to make it more appealing. And in many ways, it could be more sexualized than reality. And so, what are some ways that we can be cautious of that and kind of step away from that mindset?
Well, I think you bring up a really good point. I mean, I think we're at a point where, I mean, as much as we might not like to think about it, we're kind of at the precipice of what's going to be opening up. Like we're kind of like we went through like the narrow tunnel, so to speak, to get to the where it's going to just, the chasm gets much wider. I think very quickly. We didn't get into the idea of sex robots. We didn't get into the idea of what AI can do with those things, but there certainly we're on like the cusp of that. There was a video I saw in one of the trainings that they showed. It was basically a year's difference between, the robots. I think it was, the one was like 2014, the next one was like 2015 or 16. And the first one you can see, we could obviously tell, it's a robot. I can tell it's not real, right? But when you get to the 2016 one, so this is 10 years ago now, almost, um, you had that really weird feeling of this is just real enough to look like it's real, even though I know it isn't, kind of thing. So that's a space where, what does that do for us now? How does that change relationships? Are people going to have relationships with robots, not relationships with human beings? You add
Mm-hmm.
AI into that and all those kind of things, and then we've heard already how AI can affects therapists, in the sense that people are trying to find ways to make that be their empathetic response, or however they want to word that. But you add the sexual component into that. What does that do? How does that change? There's a lot there we don't even really know how to get into. But to answer your question, how do we kind of get away from these ideas of the false reality? I think is really being about, like you said, I think exactly goes back to what you talked about earlier. It's about being in relationship with the people who are in front of us. It's about getting out from behind the screens. It's about getting away from having the intimacy with a device and have intimacy with a human. Now, again, that's easy for us to sit here and talk about that. I think it's easy for us all to say, okay, this is a good way of doing it. But what I do like is somebody, I know somebody personally who actually has gotten into the idea of just doing a year long unplug of all their social media and et cetera, and those kind of things. That might be a really good thing for some folks. It may not be a year, maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's 3 weeks, but I do think doing some type of fast, some degree like that, is a really good thing to do. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and then also being intentional, going back to that word, taking your fasting time and going and doing those things that you're not doing when you're on your phone. So, like you said, going out and doing the walks, going out and going to the store and interacting with people, and going to do something new and social, or going to volunteer somewhere, or do some hobbies you like to do, whatever that is, to help you be in reality. Now, I think from a media consumption perspective, we assume reality is like the news versus social media, when really both of those are sort of in a fantasy space. They're just different, right? It's a different sort of target that they're looking at, right? When you're in social media, it's everybody's opinion, versus the media is one specific opinion, kind of thing. So it's not
Mm-hmm.
really what's true. It's about really what can feed the entertainment, so to speak. And I think that goes back to the idea of fantasy. So I think being present, and again doing things like, so one of the things we used to do with the guys a lot of times was like learning how to just go out and spend 5 minutes outside in your backyard. What are five things you see, four things you could hear, three things you can
Yeah.
touch, two things you can smell. I mean, those are all grounding exercises, but it's the same kind of concept. I mean, you're getting yourself away from the screen, you're getting yourself into something physical. So some of those are definitely things you can use in that way, to kind of get you back in reality.
Essentially, by doing that, you're getting your mind out of the internet and back into your body.
Yep.
And it's going back to those mindfulness principles I mentioned earlier. This
Yep.
is why I teach these principles, because I've
Absolutely. Mindfulness is
noticed
great.
these things are pretty well lost if we're not aware of ourselves. We lose our minds in the internet. We become mentally unwell. Our relationships start falling apart. We develop addictions, all kinds of things. Even our physical health starts to suffer as we're more sedentary and we don't go outside. And I was thinking too, the work that I do is very dependent on the internet. I mean, obviously, right now we're recording a podcast remotely over the internet. I'm sitting in my office. I wish I could be outside because it's actually nice weather right now for early February. But I'm going to go outside later for sure.
Yeah.
I'm going to do it
Yeah.
on purpose so I can be in my body in the present moment and just be part of life instead of just part of the internet. So you mentioned AI, and I am deeply, deeply concerned about AI because especially those who are part of Generation Z seem to be, I wouldn't say that they're totally dependent on it, but they're definitely starting to get that way, at least the few that I have spoken to. So, I mean, these are college students, current college students, high schoolers. They're starting to use AI a lot more, especially to help them write papers in college. And the professors are well aware that they're using AI. I think professors have this idea that it's just this inevitable technology. We just have to be okay with it. But I'm noticing that people are losing their ability to think for themselves.
Yeah.
And
It ruins critical thinking.
it ruins critical thinking, it ruins creativity. And I'm not going to lie, I've used it a little bit myself,
Mhm.
but
I
I'm
have as
really
well.
cautious about it because I want to keep the mental skills that I have to create outlines, to write blog posts and whatever it is that I'm working on. But then once in a while, it does make sense to use that because it is
Yeah.
available. And so we just have to be mindful of what we're doing. Once again, get our heads out of the internet and back into our bodies.
Yeah. Yeah. There's an AI course from Google that's actually really good. I took it last year because I was interested in how it applied to what I was doing. And so, creating outlines and doing some different things like I'm doing right now, making my program we were talking about earlier. Um, those have been really helpful. Helps me to put that together, and it helps me to go through and edit it and those kind of things. But one of the things that they teach you is that you're not supposed to just put in the prompt, take the prompt and copy it and keep it. It's you have to go through it and re-edit it and try to make it your own as best you can.
You have to
One of the
think
things
about
with
it.
Yeah, and so one of the things I've noticed, even with like outlines, it's tough is that sometimes it words it exactly the way you would word it anyway. So you have to kind of get creative and how do you change it and those kind of things. So, but I'm with you. I think there's certainly a number of it that you want to be cautious about how much you're depending on it because it does something that, like you said, ruins your critical thinking, it ruins your creativity. I know people who will take it, like you said, write a blog post and give it an opportunity to clean it up, maybe get some punctuation right. Like I'm terrible with grammar. I like to write, but I'm like the worst punctuator in the world. So for me, that would be useful for it. I would really benefit from that in that way.
Yeah.
But I'm with you. You got to you got to use it responsibly. You got to use it ethically. It's something that's not just a dependency, because otherwise it will be. Absolutely, you won't. You will just I'm gonna type in this one sentence prompt and I'm gonna get all this feedback from that way. And I imagine as time goes, there probably will be some limitations that they'll put in place so that it doesn't just become something that, yeah, it'll be the Wild West. Otherwise, everybody will just like be able to do whatever they want to do, and that's never good.
Yeah, I have seen some things already where they're talking about regulating like AI generated images. They need to
Yep.
have a specific watermark to make it clear that this was generated by
Mhm.
AI and it's not a real photo. Um, but I didn't explicitly tie this back to addiction. AI could potentially be an addiction as we become
Yeah.
more dependent on it and we lose the skill to think for ourselves.
Yeah. Sorry. If it gives you the type of if it gives you the kind of response that you're hoping for, and that's a coping skill to some degree. Absolutely, I could see that too.
Yeah, so we're coming up on the end of our episode, Patrick. I wanted to ask you one question. If you could change one thing about the way people approach health and wellness, what would it be?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just to know, like, I mean, one of the things I always say. is that none of us are really alone. We're all kind of in the same space, right? We're all learning it together. We're all different parts of our journey. None of us, when you talk about healthy, there's no ideal. I think as far as like a standard, I think everyone's healthy in their own. They got to figure out how to be healthiest in their own space. Now, there's things that certainly are unhealthy. We don't want to do those things. We obviously want to get into be more healthier, but I think people tend to be really hard on themselves on, it's like being that, being perfect or not, right? It's the pass fail type of approach. I know for myself, that's something that I tend to struggle with. So it's about consistency over time. And we talk, so going back to like addiction, like that's a big part of it, understanding relapses are going to happen, understanding that this behavior is not going to change overnight. You got to be patient with it. So in the same idea, health and wellness is really a consistency. It's a process. It's a lifelong process. It's not something that just all of a sudden tomorrow you decided, you love eating broccoli every day for every meal. Like that's just not going to happen, right? You gotta sort of
Right.
build over time and build it into your life. I think the other thing too is that health and wellness is also something that in different seasons is going to look differently in different places. Your physical health, your mental health, your emotional health. Kind of going back to like 8 dimensions I was speaking about earlier. There's 8 dimensions, and there's all different kinds of wellness, and it's never, that pie is never like ever solidified, right? It's always changing, and so there's gonna be things in our life that are gonna knock that pie apart and going to change it and going to modify it. Different things are going to happen in our lives. Can we accept those things? Can we take on those challenges, and can we kind of move forward and being able to know that they're going to help us grow as people? The health and wellness journey is a growth process. It's not just a one and done. So I think the one thing I'd change is helping people have that perspective. Is that it's not just about the one time choice you make, the one decision you make. It's a process of small choices you make over a period of time that get you in a further direction. You can't move forward in your life if you don't take the further, talked about earlier, take the first step of execution. It's not, I can think about going that direction, and the intention is a great first step, but the second step to the first step of thinking about it is also then executing it. And for some people, that's in some seasons is much harder than other ones. That doesn't mean that you can't do it, but it does mean that, what are the things that are going to help you get to that point? Is it going to be a support person? Is it going to be a therapist? Is it going to be a coach? Is it going to be a trusted friend? Is it going to be a podcast you listen to? Is it music you have? Whatever it is that helps you start to execute, I think that's a big thing to consider that. So knowing that health and wellness is not something that just happens. It's something that you have to be intentional and continue to work at.
It's an ongoing process, and relapse is part of the recovery process, is what I was taught in addictions counseling. So, okay, one last thing. If people wanted to find you to work with you, how could they find you?
Absolutely. So, no, I don't have a website, but I have a Patreon channel that acts as my website. So, patreon.com/bloomworks. It's free to become a member. We do have a 10-month subscription if you want deeper, if you want more stuff there. But all the podcasts I do, all of the some of my resources I put up there, articles I like, articles I find, things like that are all up there for free. You certainly are welcome to join that. The email is bloomworkscc@gmx.com. That's my direct email for the company, so you can get in touch with me. There's also a therapy portal link if you go to my Google business. So if you look up Bloomworks Concepts and Coaching LLC on Google, there's a Google business page. You can link right to my therapy portal, and you can schedule. And I do offer free consultation, 30-minute consultation for people who are interested and want to work with me. Then get an opportunity to see if it'd be good to work together, and kind of set up kind of what my other perspective of the business is, and then we go from there. So those are some ways you can reach me. Also, you can also reach me on LinkedIn as well. It's Patrick Eilers, MA, LPC, and then Bloomworks Concepts and Coaching. You can look up through there as well.
Okay, great. And I'll put those in the show notes.
Great.
Okay, thanks so much, Patrick.
Thanks so much, Cody. Appreciate it. Good conversation with you.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you leave a review. That really helps me out. And also subscribe to the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. Real Food Mental Health is intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on this podcast is not intended to replace any medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. While I am a healthcare provider, I am not your provider. Always seek the advice of an appropriate healthcare practitioner with any personal questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast. Reliance on information provided by this podcast is at your own risk.